Good evening. Tonight we descend into a story that begins not with a gunshot, but with a glass, a simple drink. In January of 1927, doctors in New York began noticing something they could not explain. Men were arriving at hospitals blind. Some could no longer stand. Others slipped quietly into comas. They had not been shot. They had not been stabbed in some speakeasy brawl or caught in crossfire between rival bootleggers. They had only done what millions of Americans were secretly doing at the time. They had taken a drink, but this drink was different. It carried no warning label, no skull and crossbones on the bottle, no whispered confession of danger from the bartender who poured it. Because it had not come from a criminal trying to poison his customers. It had come from the United States government. During Prohibition, the manufacture and sale of beverage alcohol was illegal, but industrial alcohol was not. Factories needed it for paints, solvents, fuels, so the government had ordered it to be poisoned, mixed with chemicals so toxic that even redistillation could not make it safe. Methanol, formaldehyde, benzene. Officials believed the fear of death would discourage drinking. It did not. Instead, it created one of the quietest public health disasters in American history. By the time those New York doctors began connecting the cases in early 1927, hundreds were already dead. Thousands more would follow. Tonight, we explore the complete arc of American Prohibition, how a moral crusade became a lethal experiment, how the war on alcohol created organized crime, and how a government, in its determination to enforce virtue, accepted the deaths of its own citizens as the cost of righteousness. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the darker corners of history. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated by the different places that gather here at night. Phone face down, volume low. Take a slow breath. Let's go in. To understand how America arrived at Prohibition and how Prohibition arrived at poison, we must begin not in the 1920s, but nearly a century earlier, in the smoky taverns and riverside saloons of the early American Republic, in the quiet desperation of families ruined by drink, in the pulpits where ministers thundered against demon rum. The story of Prohibition is not a story of sudden madness. It is a story of genuine problems, reasonable concerns, and solutions that metastasized into something monstrous. In the early decades of the 19th century, the United States had what could only be called a drinking problem. Not a problem of perception or moral panic, but a genuine crisis of consumption. Historians estimate that in 1820, the typical adult white American male consumed nearly a half pint of whiskey per day. Not per week, per day. This was not the occasional dram with dinner or the social drink at a wedding. This was sustained daily, heavy alcohol consumption on a scale difficult for modern Americans to comprehend. Whiskey was cheap, grain was plentiful, especially on the frontier, and distillation turned surplus corn into a commodity that could be stored, transported, and sold. It was safer than water in many places. It was used as currency in some transactions. It was medicine, social lubricant, and anesthetic all at once. It was woven into the rhythms of daily life in ways that made abstinence seem almost unnatural. But the consequences were impossible to ignore. Alcoholism ravaged families. Men drank away their wages, leaving wives and children destitute. Violence accompanied drunkenness. The saloon became a symbol of everything wrong with urban life. especially as immigration and industrialization transformed American cities in the latter half of the 19th century. German immigrants brought beer gardens. Irish immigrants brought pub culture. Saloons proliferated. By the turn of the 20th century, there were an estimated 300,000 saloons across the United States. They were not just drinking establishments. They were political machines. Saloon keepers helped immigrants find work, navigate bureaucracy, learn English. In exchange, the saloon owner delivered votes. The saloon was where ward bosses held court, where police sergeants collected their bribes, where labor organizers met in back rooms and criminals planned their enterprises. The saloon was power, and power was often corrupt. This was not hysteria. This was observable social reality. Families were destroyed. Poverty and crime rates were demonstrably higher in neighborhoods thick with saloons. Public drunkenness was epidemic. Industrial accidents killed workers who came to the factory floor still drunk from the night before. The link between alcohol and social dysfunction was not imaginary. It was real, and it demanded a response. The first response was moderation. The temperance movement of the 1820s and 1830s, born from the fires of religious revivalism that swept through upstate New York and New England, initially advocated not prohibition, but restraint. Do not drink to excess. Take the pledge. Sign your name to a promise of sobriety. Join a temperance society. Support each other in resisting temptation. The approach was voluntary, moral, suasive. It was rooted in Protestant Christianity, particularly among Methodists and Baptists, who saw alcohol as a sin, but believed the cure was conversion, not coercion. This was the era of moral reform movements. Abolitionists were fighting to rid the country of slavery. Temperance advocates began to see alcohol in the same terms. Both were social evils. Both corrupted individuals and poisoned communities. Both must be eradicated if America were ever to achieve the perfection that God intended. The temperance movement became entangled with abolitionism, with women's rights, with a broader impulse toward what historians call perfectionism, the belief that human society could be perfected through moral reform and righteous legislation. But as the century wore on, as saloons multiplied and alcohol consumption remained stubbornly high, despite decades of moral suasion, the temperance movement began to shift. Moderation was not enough. Voluntary pledges were not enough. If individuals could not be trusted to resist temptation, then temptation itself must be removed. The movement began calling not for temperance, but for prohibition, not restraint, but eradication. Legislate the saloon out of existence. Make the manufacture and sale of alcohol illegal. Use the power of the state to enforce what moral suasion could not achieve. In 1874, a new organization emerged from the rubble of the Women's Crusade, a grassroots movement in which thousands of women had marched on saloons, knelt in prayer outside their doors, and shamed drinkers into abandoning the bottle. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, became a force in American politics. Under the leadership of Frances Willard, it grew into one of the largest women's organizations in the country, with chapters in nearly every state. Willard was a visionary, a radical, a woman who saw the fight against alcohol as inseparable from the fight for women's suffrage, labor reform, social welfare, even vegetarianism. Her philosophy was called "Do Everything," a scattershot approach to reform that touched on every aspect of society. The WCTU lobbied for local laws restricting alcohol, It created an educational campaign that reached into nearly every schoolroom in the nation, teaching children that alcohol was poison. It allied itself with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other suffragists, recognizing that women who could vote could legislate the saloon out of existence. But the very breadth of Willard's vision became a weakness. Do everything meant focus on nothing. By the 1890s, the summit in the WCTU's message was diluted. It was associated with too many causes, too many agendas. It had lost the single-minded intensity required to achieve nationwide prohibition. That intensity would come from a different source, from a man who understood that power, real political power, came not from moral arguments, but from the ruthless application of pressure to those who held office. In 1893, in Oberlin, Ohio, a former lawyer and ordained minister named Howard Hyde Russell founded a new organization. He called it the Anti-Saloon League. The name was deceptively modest. The ambition was not. Russell had a vision of an organization unlike any that had come before. It would be nonpartisan, working with Democrats and Republicans alike. It would focus on a single issue, the prohibition of alcohol, not labor reform, not women's suffrage, not the price of grain or the tariff on imports. Just alcohol. And it would use every available tool of modern politics to achieve its goal. Lobbying, propaganda, media campaigns, electoral pressure, endorsements, campaign contributions, threats, bribery if necessary, though that would not be spoken aloud. Russell found his weapon in a young man named Wayne Bidwell Wheeler. Wheeler had been born in 1869 in Brookfield Township, Ohio, the heart of Temperance country. As a child, he had been frightened by an intoxicated hired hand. The fear hardened over the years into conviction. Alcohol was evil. It destroyed lives. It must be eradicated. At Oberlin College, Wheeler heard Russell speak at a public meeting in 1893. Russell was recruiting. Wheeler was receptive. He signed the Temperance Pledge that night. He signed his life away to the cause. Wheeler was brilliant, tireless, utterly without scruple when it came to advancing the League's agenda. He put himself through Oberlin, working as a waiter, a janitor, a teacher, a salesman. He earned his law degree from Western Reserve University in 1898. By 1902, he was a leader of the Anti-Saloon League, and he was perfecting what would come to be known, with a mixture of admiration and revulsion, as Wheelerism. Wheelerism was pressure politics. It was the use of the ballot box as a weapon. Wheeler did not care whether a politician drank or not. He cared only how that politician voted. If you supported the League's agenda, Wheeler would endorse you, fund you, mobilize Protestant churches to get out the vote for you. If you opposed the League, Wheeler would back your opponent, finance a primary challenge, dig up dirt on you, leak embarrassing information to the press, threaten to withdraw support from your party unless you were removed from your committee assignment. He was ruthless. He was effective. He coined the term pressure group. He became, in the words of one New York newspaper, the legislative bully before whom the Senate of the United States sits up and begs. The League was not like the WCTU. It was not a social club or a moral improvement society. It was a machine, a political machine. It operated like a corporation with a hierarchical structure, professional staff, and a single-minded focus on results. Its publishing arm, the American Issue Publishing Company, was based in Westerville, Ohio. During the League's peak, it issued more than 40 tons of anti-liquor publications every month. Pamphlets, newspapers, propaganda. all of it carefully crafted to persuade voters that alcohol was the root of every social ill and that prohibition was the solution. The League organized what it called saloon field days, Sundays when ministers in thousands of churches across the country would preach against alcohol and pass the collection plate for contributions to the League. In Illinois alone, the League coordinated with pastors in over 2,000 churches to discuss pending temperance legislation. The sermons were not subtle. The message was clear. Contact your representative. Tell him to vote dry, or we will vote him out. Wheeler was a master of leverage. He understood that in a democracy, you do not need a majority to win. You need a committed, organized minority that can swing close elections. In a race decided by a few hundred votes, a few thousand temperance voters could be decisive. Wheeler would identify close districts. He would back dry candidates regardless of party. He would mobilize churches to get those candidates elected. And once in office, those candidates owed their seats to the League. They voted the way Wheeler told them to vote. By the 1910s, the League controlled 6 Congresses. It dictated policy to presidents. It was the most powerful single-issue lobbying organization in American history. But power alone does not rewrite the Constitution. For that, Wheeler needed more than political muscle. He needed a perfect storm of circumstances. He needed the nation to be ready, morally and economically, to embrace prohibition. And in the years leading up to 1920, that storm arrived. The first gust came in 1913 with the ratification of the 16th Amendment, the federal income tax. Before 1913, the federal government derived a significant portion of its revenue from taxes on alcohol. Taxing liquor was one of the oldest and most reliable sources of federal income, dating back to the earliest days of the Republic. But the income tax changed the equation. If the government could tax income directly, it no longer needed liquor taxes to fund its operations. The economic barrier to prohibition had been removed. Wheeler and the League had lobbied hard for the income tax, not because they believed in progressive taxation, but because they knew it would make prohibition economically feasible. It was a strategic masterstroke. The second gust came in 1914, when war broke out in Europe. The Great War, later called the First World War, did not immediately involve the United States, but it reshaped American politics in ways that favored the prohibitionists. The war created demands for grain, conservation. Grain was needed to feed soldiers, to feed the European allies. Using grain to make beer and whiskey seemed wasteful, even unpatriotic. The Anti-Saloon League seized on this argument. Prohibition was not just moral, it was patriotic. It was necessary for the war effort. The third gust came in 1917, after the United States entered the war. Anti-German hysteria swept the nation. German Americans, who had been a respected and integrated part of American society, suddenly became suspect. And the brewing industry was dominated by German Americans. Names like Anheuser, Busch, Pabst, Schlitz. The League did not hesitate to exploit this. It portrayed brewers as the enemy. Drinking beer was supporting the Kaiser. Prohibition was an act of loyalty to America. The propaganda was crude, but it was effective. In a time of war, when questioning someone's patriotism could destroy them, the brewers had no defense. The wartime restrictions began even before the 18th Amendment was proposed. The Selective Service Act of May 1917 made it unlawful to sell intoxicating liquor to any member of the military while in uniform. The definition of intoxicating was set at one point 4% alcohol, less strict than what would come later, but a sign of things to come. Grain conservation laws curtailed brewing, distilleries were repurposed, saloons near military bases were shut down. By the time Congress proposed the 18th Amendment in December 1917, a significant portion of the alcohol industry had already been dismantled. Prohibition, in effect, had already begun. On December 18, 1917, Congress voted to propose the 18th Amendment to the states. The vote was overwhelming, 68% in the House of Representatives, 76% in the Senate. The amendment required ratification by 3/4 of the states, and Congress imposed a 7-year deadline. It seemed like a reasonable timeline. Amending the Constitution was supposed to be difficult, a deliberate process requiring broad consensus. But the Anti-Saloon League had spent 2 decades building that consensus, state by state, district by district, precinct by precinct. The machine that Wayne Wheeler had built was ready. The amendment was sent to the states on December 18, 1917. 13 months later, on January 16, 1919, Nebraska became the 36th state to ratify. 3/4 of the states had approved. It was the fastest ratification of a constitutional amendment in American history to that point. Eventually, 46 of the 48 states would ratify. Only Connecticut and Rhode Island refused. The speed was shocking, unprecedented. But it was not an accident. It was the result of decades of organizing, lobbying, pressure, propaganda, and political maneuvering. Wheeler had built a machine, and the machine worked. On January 29, 1919, Acting Secretary of State Frank L. Polk certified that the amendment had been ratified, but the amendment included a 1-year delay before it would take effect. This was to give the government time to prepare for enforcement and to give the alcohol industry time to wind down its operations. The date was set, January 17, 1920. At 1 minute past midnight, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors for beverage purposes would become illegal throughout the United States. To define what the amendment meant in practice, Congress passed enabling legislation in October 1919. The National Prohibition Act, better known as the Volstead Act, named for Andrew Volstead, the Republican congressman from Minnesota who championed it. But everyone knew the real author was Wayne Wheeler. The Volstead Act set the rules. It defined intoxicating liquors as any beverage containing more than 0.5% alcohol by volume. This was stricter than many had expected. Beer and wine, which some had assumed would be exempt, were now illegal. The public was surprised, outraged in some quarters, but the law was the law. President Woodrow Wilson vetoed the Volstead Act, arguing that it went too far. Congress overrode his veto the next day. The House voted to override immediately. The Senate followed the day after. The political power of the Anti-Saloon League was absolute. January 17, 1920. Midnight, Prohibition began. The 5th largest industry in the United States was now illegal. Tens of thousands of jobs vanished overnight. Breweries shut down. Distilleries closed. Saloons locked their doors. In some cities, there was celebration. Temperance advocates gathered in churches to sing hymns and thank God for deliverance. In other cities, there was mourning. In San Francisco, The streets were jammed with cars, trucks, wagons, every imaginable form of conveyance, as people rushed to stockpile alcohol before the deadline. Porches and staircase landings were piled high with crates of liquor. One last binge before the taps ran dry. The next morning, the nation woke up dry. Or so it seemed. Wayne Wheeler believed he had won. The Anti-Saloon League believed it had achieved its goal. The 18th Amendment was now part of the Constitution, as permanent and unassailable as the First Amendment or the Bill of Rights. No constitutional amendment had ever been repealed. Prohibition would last forever. America would be sober. Families would be whole. Crime would decline. The saloon and all the corruption and vice it represented would be a memory. The noble experiment, as Herbert Hoover would later call it, had begun. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the prohibitionists might actually be right. In the first months after January 17th, 1920, alcohol consumption did decline. Dramatically. Public drunkenness fell. Arrests for disorderly conduct dropped. Hospital admissions for alcoholic psychosis decreased. Deaths from cirrhosis of the liver, the surest measure of chronic alcohol abuse, fell by 50% in some cities. The streets seemed quieter. The saloons were dark. Wayne Wheeler and his allies at the Anti-Saloon League felt vindicated. The power of the federal government, combined with the moral authority of the Constitution itself, had succeeded where decades of preaching and pleading had failed. America was becoming sober. The experiment was working. But beneath the surface, a different reality was taking shape. Drinking had not stopped. It had simply moved out of the saloons and into private homes, out of the public eye and into the shadows. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act had been carefully written to prohibit the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. But they did not prohibit possession or consumption. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate choice. The framers of prohibition understood that attempting to criminalize the mere act of drinking would be politically impossible and practically unenforceable. The law targeted the supply chain, not the individual drinker. If you already owned alcohol when prohibition began, you could drink it legally in your own home. If you could find alcohol after prohibition began, you could drink it legally, as long as you did not manufacture it, sell it, or transport it yourself. The law created a strange asymmetry. The seller was a criminal. Thus, buyer was not. This loophole was not lost on Americans with means. In the weeks leading up to January 17, 1920, those who could afford it stockpiled. Basements and attics filled with cases of whiskey, crates of wine, barrels of beer. The wealthy would not go thirsty. They had laid in supplies to last for years. Prohibition for them was an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. But for those who could not afford to stockpile, or who had not thought to do so, the equation was different. Demand did not disappear just because supply became illegal. And where demand exists, supply will find a way. Home production exploded. The Volstead Act prohibited the manufacture of intoxicating liquors, but it allowed for the production of non-intoxicating fruit juices. The line was blurry. Grape growers in California, suddenly facing the collapse of the wine industry, pivoted to selling concentrated grape juice. The packaging came with warning labels, detailed, helpful warning labels, instructions on exactly what steps to avoid if you did not want your grape juice to ferment into wine. Do not add yeast. Do not store in a warm place for 21 days. Do not seal the container. The labels were absurd, transparently so. They were recipes disguised as warnings. Sales of grape concentrate soared. Home winemaking became a national pastime. The production of hard liquor at home was more difficult but not impossible. Distilling required equipment, knowledge, and care. Done poorly, it could produce methanol instead of ethanol, wood alcohol instead of grain alcohol, poison instead of drink. But done correctly, it produced whiskey, gin, rum. Northern cities developed a fondness for what was called bathtub gin, liquor distilled in makeshift stills and diluted in the bathtub to approximate the proper strength. In rural areas, particularly in Appalachia and the South, moonshine production became a cottage industry. Hidden stills deep in the woods, recipes passed down through generations, quality that ranged from surprisingly good to actively lethal. Law enforcement pursued the moonshiners relentlessly, not out of moral conviction so much as economic necessity. Moonshine bypassed government taxation. It always had. That was the point. Making it was a crime before Prohibition, and it remained a crime after, though now it was a crime with dramatically increased demand. But for most Americans, home production was too much trouble. They wanted to buy their alcohol, not make it, and so the market responded. Drugstores began selling medicinal alcohol. The Volstead Act included an exemption for alcohol prescribed by a physician for medical purposes. It was a reasonable exemption. Alcohol had legitimate medical uses, tinctures, antiseptics, tonics. But the exemption was immediately and flagrantly abused. In the first 6 months of Prohibition, over 15,000 doctors and 57,000 pharmacists received licenses to prescribe or sell medicinal alcohol. Throughout the 1920s, physicians wrote an estimated 11 million prescriptions per year. The ailments treated were vague and varied: anxiety, insomnia, indigestion, depression. The prescriptions were legal. The alcohol was taxed and regulated, but everyone understood what was happening. The drugstore had replaced the saloon. Religious institutions exploited a similar loophole. Sacramental wine was exempt from Prohibition. Catholics, Episcopalians, Jews, all required wine for religious rituals. The Volstead Act could not interfere with the free exercise of religion. So sacramental wine production was allowed to continue. And mysteriously, the demand for sacramental wine increased during Prohibition. New congregations formed. Membership in certain denominations rose. Priests and rabbis found themselves ordering far more wine than they had before. Some of it was used for legitimate religious purposes. Much of it was not. The wine made its way into private homes, into social gatherings, into hands that had never held a prayer book. The exemption was legal. The abuse was obvious. But prosecuting clergy for providing sacramental wine was a political nightmare. Enforcement was lax. These were the legal and semi-legal pathways around Prohibition: the grey markets, the loopholes. The exemptions stretched beyond recognition. They allowed a certain portion of the population to continue drinking without breaking the law, or at least without breaking it in ways that would land them in jail. But these pathways could not meet the demand. The vast majority of Americans who wanted to drink during Prohibition would have to turn to the black market. And the black market, in turn, would create something far more dangerous than the saloons had ever been. The supply chains were obvious. Alcohol was legal in Canada. It was legal in Mexico. It was legal in the Bahamas, in Cuba, in the French islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, off the coast of Newfoundland. Ships under foreign registry could carry alcohol without violating American law. as long as they stayed outside the 3-mile territorial limit, which they did, barely. The ships would anchor just beyond the line, and smaller boats would ferry the cargo to shore under cover of darkness. This was called rum running, and it became a massive enterprise along both coasts and the Great Lakes. The border with Canada was thousands of miles long, much of it wilderness, impossible to patrol effectively. Bootleggers would smuggle whiskey across by truck, by boat, by train, even by dog sled in winter. The border with Mexico was equally porous. Alcohol flowed north, money flowed south. The governments on both sides made token efforts at interdiction, but the profits were too large, the distances too great, the enforcement too thinly spread. Domestic smuggling required organization, coordination. Someone had to arrange for the alcohol to be purchased abroad, transported to the border or coast, moved inland, distributed to speakeasies and private buyers, all while avoiding or bribing law enforcement. This was not the work of lone criminals. This was the work of syndicates. In New York, underworld profiteer Arnold Rothstein, famous for fixing the 1919 World Series, ran shipments of alcohol through Lake Ontario and down the Hudson River into the thousands of speakeasies that had sprung up in the city. In Cleveland, the Mayfield Road Gang used speedboats to crisscross Lake Erie, moving Canadian whiskey to the American shore. In Chicago, where the bootlegging operations would become the most infamous, the gangs fought for control of supply routes and distribution networks with a ferocity that turned streets into war zones. But smuggling alone could not satisfy demand. The sheer volume of alcohol consumed in the United States before Prohibition was staggering. Replacing even a fraction of that supply through smuggling would have required a logistics operation beyond the capacity of any criminal organization. The bootleggers needed another source, and they found it in the most unexpected place, in the government's own regulations: industrial alcohol. Alcohol produced not for drinking, but for manufacturing, for paints, varnishes, solvents, cleaning products, fuels, perfumes, medicines. Industrial alcohol was chemically identical to beverage alcohol. Both were ethanol, ethyl alcohol, the same molecule. The difference was purity and intent. Industrial alcohol was produced in vast quantities because industry needed it. And because it was not intended for human consumption, it was not subject to the same taxes and regulations as beverage alcohol. To prevent industrial alcohol from being diverted to the beverage market, the government had instituted a practice called denaturing, the addition of chemicals to make the alcohol unfit for drinking. This practice dated back to 1906, long before Prohibition. The idea was simple: add something that tasted terrible or smelled terrible or made you sick if you drank it, and no one would try to drink industrial alcohol. Manufacturers would be exempted from the beverage alcohol tax because their product was no longer drinkable. The most common denaturant was methanol, methyl alcohol, wood alcohol. Methanol is a poison. A small amount can cause blindness. A larger amount can cause death. It was cheap, readily available, and effective at rendering ethanol undrinkable. Other denaturants included compounds that tasted bitter, substances that caused nausea, chemicals that would make you violently ill. The goal was not to kill anyone. The goal was to make industrial alcohol so unpleasant that no one would attempt to drink it. And before Prohibition, the system worked reasonably well. There was little incentive to drink denatured alcohol when you could buy a drink legally at a saloon for a few cents. But Prohibition changed the incentive structure. Suddenly, beverage alcohol was illegal and expensive, industrial alcohol was legal and plentiful. By the mid-1920s, the Treasury Department estimated that approximately 60 million gallons of industrial alcohol were being stolen each year. 60 million gallons. Stolen from warehouses, diverted from factories, smuggled out in barrels and drums and tanks, disappearing into the underground economy. The bootleggers did not steal it to use in paints or solvents. They stole it to drink. Or more precisely, they stole it to sell to people who would drink it. But denatured alcohol was poisonous. You could not simply pour it into a glass and serve it. You had to remove the denaturants first. This required chemistry, knowledge, equipment. The bootlegging operations began hiring chemists, skilled professionals who understood distillation, purification, separation. The syndicates paid these chemists far more than the government did, and the chemists were good at their jobs. They developed methods for redistilling denatured alcohol, removing the methanol and other additives, returning the ethanol to a state that was drinkable, or at least drinkable enough to sell. They added flavorings to mask any residual taste. They diluted the redistilled alcohol with water to approximate the strength of whiskey or gin. The process was called renaturation, and it became the backbone of the illegal alcohol trade in America. Stolen and redistilled industrial alcohol became the primary source of liquor in the country. The federal government watched this happen. They knew it was happening. Treasury Department officials could see the numbers. 60 million gallons of industrial alcohol disappearing, the black market thriving, enforcement failing. Prohibition was supposed to stop drinking. It was not stopping drinking. It was creating a criminal economy on a scale unprecedented in American history. Something had to be done. But what? Increasing enforcement was expensive and politically difficult. Hiring more prohibition agents, building more jails, prosecuting more cases. Congress was reluctant to allocate the funds. The public was growing weary of the intrusion. Raids on speakeasies made for good newspaper headlines, but they did not stop the speakeasies from reopening the next week. Arresting bootleggers did not stop new bootleggers from taking their place. The economics were too compelling. As long as there was demand, there would be supply, and demand showed no signs of decreasing. So the government turned to a different approach. If they could not stop the theft of industrial alcohol, they would make the theft irrelevant. They would make industrial alcohol so poisonous that no amount of redistillation could render it safe to drink. The bootleggers could steal it if they wanted. They could try to redistill it. But when people drank it, they would go blind. They would seize. They would die. And the fear of death, the government believed, would accomplish what the law could not. It would stop people from drinking. In 1926, under the administration of President Calvin Coolidge, the Treasury Department issued new regulations. The denaturing formulas, all 70 of them, were to be made more deadly. Manufacturers of industrial alcohol were ordered to increase the concentration of methanol, to add additional poisons. The specifics varied, but the goal was uniform: make industrial alcohol lethal. By mid-1927, the formula that became standard included a precise and horrifying mixture. For every 100 parts of ethyl alcohol, manufacturers were required to add 4 parts methanol, 2 1/4 parts pyridine base, and half a part benzene. Methanol, as noted, causes blindness and death. Pyridine is a toxic organic compound, bitter-tasting, foul-smelling, damaging to the liver and kidneys. Benzene is a carcinogen linked to leukemia, dangerous even in small amounts. But the regulations did not stop there. Depending on the intended use of the industrial alcohol, other substances could be added. Kerosene, gasoline, brucine, a plant alkaloid closely related to strychnine, one of the most potent poisons known, iodine, zinc, mercury salts, nicotine, ether, formaldehyde, chloroform, camphor, carbolic acid, quinine, acetone. The list read like a toxicology textbook. These were not substances intended to make alcohol taste bad. These were substances intended to kill. The Treasury Department demanded that at least 10% of the total industrial alcohol content be methanol. 10%. This was the key. Methanol is difficult to separate from ethanol through ordinary distillation. The two alcohols have similar boiling points. A skilled chemist with proper equipment might be able to reduce the methanol concentration, but removing it entirely was nearly impossible. And even a small amount of methanol, just a few milliliters, could cause permanent blindness. A slightly larger amount could be fatal. 3 ordinary drinks of the new formula, the Treasury Department's own reports noted, could cause blindness. 13th drinks. The chemists working for the bootleggers were skilled, but they were not miracle workers. Some of the poison would remain, and when people drank the redistilled alcohol, they would ingest that poison. The government made no attempt to hide what it was doing. This was not a secret program. It was public policy. Treasury officials gave statements to the press. The new denaturing formulas were announced. The rationale was explained. Industrial alcohol was being stolen and sold as beverage alcohol. This was illegal. The government had a responsibility to enforce the law. If making industrial alcohol more poisonous discouraged theft and consumption, then that was an appropriate enforcement tool. The responsibility for any deaths, the officials argued, lay not with the government, but with the criminals who stole the alcohol and the individuals who chose to drink it. The government was under no obligation to provide drinkable alcohol when the Constitution prohibited it. Seymour M. Lohman, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in charge of prohibition enforcement, put it bluntly in a statement to reporters. The people drinking poisoned alcohol, he said, were dying off fast from poison hooch. And if the result was a sober America, then a good job will have been done. There was no apology in his tone, no regret. The deaths were acceptable. They were the cost of enforcing the law. They were, in the cold logic of the enforcement regime, the point. Fear would accomplish what raids and arrests could not. The threat of blindness and death would stop people from drinking illegal alcohol. Or so the theory went. The theory was wrong. People did not stop drinking. They could not see the poison. Industrial alcohol, once redistilled and mixed with flavorings, looked like whiskey or gin. It smelled like whiskey or gin. The speakeasies that served it did not advertise that it might kill you. The bootleggers who sold it did not include warning labels. And the people who drank it, millions of them, had no way of knowing whether the glass in their hand contained relatively safe smuggled Canadian whiskey or redistilled industrial alcohol laced with methanol. Drinking during Prohibition had always been a gamble. Now it was Russian roulette. The results were immediate and horrific. Christmas of 1926, New York City, December 24th, Christmas Eve. 60 people arrived at Bellevue Hospital. Poisoning, alcohol poisoning, but not the ordinary kind. Not the stupor and nausea and hangover of drinking too much. This was different. They were convulsing, hallucinating, struggling to breathe. Their vision was failing. By Christmas morning, 8 of them were dead. The doctors knew what they were seeing. methanol poisoning, wood alcohol. The symptoms were unmistakable: metabolic acidosis, optic nerve damage, respiratory failure. There was no antidote, no treatment beyond supportive care and hope. Some of the patients would survive, but remain blind for the rest of their lives. Others would suffer permanent neurological damage. The lucky ones would recover fully, though the experience would leave scars that no physician could measure. By the end of December, the death toll in New York from that single batch of poisoned liquor had climbed to 23. Dozens more were blinded. The newspapers covered the story. The New York Times ran headlines: "Poisoned rum kills 5 on Christmas Day." Holiday death toll from alcohol reaches 23. The public was horrified. But the horror was not enough to stop the drinking, because for every person who died, there were thousands who drank and survived. The odds seemed acceptable. The speakeasies stayed open. The bootleggers kept selling. The drinkers kept drinking. The poisoning in New York was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a national pattern. The new denaturing formulas had been implemented across the country. Industrial alcohol was being stolen, redistilled, and sold in every major city. And in every major city, people were dying. The final numbers for 1926 in New York alone were staggering. 1,200 people sickened by poisonous alcohol, 400 dead, 400 in a single city, in a single year, and 1927 was worse. By the end of that year, 700 people had died in New York from methanol poisoning. The chief medical examiner, a man named Charles Norris, began speaking out, loudly, publicly. Norris had been appointed New York's first chief medical examiner in 1918, a reformer brought in to professionalize the city's handling of suspicious deaths. He was a scientist, a physician, a man who believed in evidence and facts. And the facts, as he saw them, were damning. On December 28, 1926, just after Christmas, Norris issued a statement to the press. It was blunt, unsparing. "The government knows it is not stopping drinking by putting poison in alcohol," he said. "It knows what the bootleggers are doing with it, and yet it continues its poisoning process, heedless of the fact that people determined to drink are daily absorbing that poison." Knowing this to be true, the United States government must be charged with the moral responsibility for the deaths that poisoned liquor causes. Moral responsibility, not legal responsibility. Norris was careful. But moral responsibility was enough. He was accusing the government of murder, not in the courtroom sense, not in the way that would lead to indictments and trials, but in the deeper sense, the sense that mattered to conscience. The government knew the poison would kill. The government continued the poisoning anyway. Therefore, the government bore responsibility for the deaths. Other public health officials joined the chorus: doctors, medical examiners, coroners. They were seeing the bodies. They were signing the death certificates. Methanol poisoning, again and again. The pattern was undeniable. A report from 1927 analyzed liquor confiscated in New York. 480,000 gallons seized in raids and arrests. Nearly all of it, the report found, contained poisons. Nearly all of it. The black market in New York was saturated with redistilled industrial alcohol, and people were drinking it because it was all they could get. The outcry reached Congress. Senators began asking questions, demanding answers. Senator James Reed of Missouri, a Democrat and a fierce opponent of prohibition, gave a speech on the Senate floor. Only one possessing the instincts of a wild beast, he said, would desire to kill or make blind the man who takes a drink of liquor, even if he purchased it from one violating the prohibition statutes. The language was inflammatory, deliberately so. Reed wanted to provoke. He wanted to force the prohibitionists to defend the indefensible, to stand up and say, yes, we think it is acceptable for people to die in order to enforce this law. Wayne Wheeler stood up. Not literally, not in the Senate chamber, but in the court of public opinion. Wheeler, by 1927, was no longer the untouchable political force he had once been. His wife had died in a horrible accident in August of that year, burned to death in a cooking fire. Her father had suffered a fatal heart attack trying to save her. Wheeler himself was in declining health, suffering from kidney disease, but he was still the voice of the Anti-Saloon League, and he was still willing to defend the poisoning program without flinching. The government is under no obligation to furnish the people with alcohol that is drinkable when the Constitution prohibits it, Wheeler said in a statement to the press. The person who drinks this industrial alcohol is a deliberate suicide. Deliberate suicide. The phrase was carefully chosen. It shifted responsibility entirely onto the drinker. You knew alcohol was illegal. You knew industrial alcohol was poisonous. You drank it anyway. Your death is your own fault. The government did not force you to drink. The bootlegger did not force you to drink. You chose. You died. Suicide. But the argument was sophistry, and everyone knew it. The people drinking redistilled industrial alcohol did not know it was poisonous. They had no way to know. The speakeasies did not boast signs. The bootleggers did not offer warnings. The alcohol looked normal, smelled normal, tasted normal or close enough. And even if they suspected it might be dangerous, what choice did they have? Prohibition had made legal alcohol unavailable. The only alcohol available was illegal, and illegal alcohol, by definition, came with risks. But those risks had been acceptable when the worst outcome was arrest or a bad hangover. Now the worst outcome was death, and the government had made that outcome more likely, deliberately, with full knowledge. That was not suicide. That was something else. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, the estimates of deaths from poisoned alcohol ranged from 10,000 to as many as 50,000, depending on how one counted. The lower number, 10,000, was the most commonly cited, and it referred specifically to deaths that could be directly attributed to methanol poisoning from redistilled industrial alcohol. The higher numbers included deaths from other forms of toxic alcohol, from poorly made moonshine, from alcohol adulterated with other poisons by unscrupulous bootleggers. But even the conservative estimate, 10,000, was a staggering toll. 10,000 people dead, not from gang violence, not from car accidents or liver disease or any of the other harms associated with alcohol, dead from poison. Poison that the government had ordered to be added to the alcohol supply. Poison that the government knew would kill. The Chemist's War, as it came to be called, was not a war in the traditional sense. There were no armies, no battles, just laboratories and warehouses and quiet decisions made by bureaucrats who believed they were enforcing the law. And on the other side, chemists hired by bootleggers, trying to outwit the government, trying to remove enough poison to make the alcohol sellable, knowing that they couldn't remove all of it, knowing that some of their customers would go blind, knowing that some would die. It was a war fought with beakers and retorts and distillation columns, and the casualties were ordinary people, people who wanted a drink, people who thought the risk was worth it, People who had no idea they were drinking poison until it was too late. Charles Norris had called it our noble experiment in extermination. The phrase stuck. It captured something essential about the moral bankruptcy of the program. Prohibition had been sold as a way to save lives, to protect families, to reduce crime and poverty and disease. And perhaps, in some narrow sense, it had achieved some of those goals in the early months, when compliance was high and alternatives were limited. But by the mid-1920s, prohibition was not saving lives. It was ending them deliberately. As a matter of policy, the noble experiment had become a lethal one, and the people dying were not the criminals. They were not the bootleggers or the gangsters. They were ordinary men and women who made the mistake of wanting a drink in a country that had decided to poison them for it. The poisoning program continued, despite the outcry, despite the death toll, despite the moral arguments and the Senate speeches and the medical examiners signing death certificates by the dozen. It continued because the alternative, in the minds of the prohibitionists, was worse. The alternative was admitting that prohibition had failed, that the law was unenforceable, that the entire edifice of moral reform and constitutional amendment and federal power had been built on a foundation of sand. And so the government kept ordering the poison. The manufacturers kept adding it. The bootleggers kept redistilling it. And people kept dying. Wayne Wheeler did not live to see the end of prohibition. He died on September 5th, 1927, at the age of 57, seeking treatment at a sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. His kidneys had failed him. His wife and father-in-law were already gone. He was buried in Columbus, Ohio, his life's work seemingly complete. The 18th Amendment was in the Constitution. Prohibition was the law of the land. And if people were dying to enforce it, well, that was the price of righteousness. Wheeler had never flinched from that logic. He had built a machine to achieve prohibition, and the machine had worked. The fact that it was now killing people was, to him, irrelevant. The law was the law, but the law, it turned out, was not permanent. And the machine that Wheeler had built for all its power could not survive the weight of its own contradictions. Prohibition had promised a better America. It had delivered poison, corruption, violence, and death. And the American people were beginning to notice. While the government was poisoning its own citizens in the name of enforcement, another transformation was taking place. Quieter in some ways, though punctuated by explosions of violence that made headlines across the country. Prohibition was creating something that had not existed before in American life, at least not on this scale. Organized crime. Not the local gangs that had controlled neighborhoods and ran protection rackets. Not the political machines that delivered votes and collected graft. But something larger, more sophisticated, more durable. Criminal syndicates that operated like corporations, with supply chains and distribution networks and market territories. Prohibition had made the fifth largest industry in America illegal overnight. And where there is demand, supply will emerge. The question was not whether criminals would fill the void. The question was which criminals, and how they would organize themselves to do it. Before Prohibition, organized crime in America was a local affair, small-time operations. In New York, street gangs controlled prostitution and gambling in their neighborhoods. In Chicago, political bosses and ward heelers ran rackets tied to city contracts and municipal corruption. In San Francisco, tong wars among Chinese immigrants over control of opium dens and gambling houses occasionally spilled into violence. but the violence was contained, internal to the community. Crime existed, certainly. Corruption existed, but it was fragmented, disorganized, competing factions operating in parallel, sometimes in conflict, rarely in cooperation. The profits were modest, the operations were crude, and law enforcement, for all its flaws, had some measure of control. Prohibition changed everything. It created a market opportunity of staggering proportions. Alcohol had been a legal industry, generating billions of dollars in economic activity. Now it was illegal, but the demand had not disappeared. Millions of Americans still wanted to drink. They were willing to pay for the privilege, and they were willing to pay far more than they had paid before, because the product was scarce and the risk was high. The economics were irresistible. A barrel of beer that cost a few dollars to produce could be sold for 10 times that in a speakeasy. A case of smuggled Canadian whiskey, purchased for $20, could be resold in New York for $200. The profit margins were extraordinary, and the market was huge. Every city in America, every town, even rural areas had demand for illegal alcohol. But meeting that demand required more than a lone bootlegger with a still in his basement or a speedboat on the Great Lakes. It required infrastructure, coordination, capital. Someone had to arrange for the alcohol to be purchased or produced. Someone had to transport it without getting caught. Someone had to distribute it to the thousands of speakeasies that had replaced the saloons. Someone had to protect the shipments from rival gangs. Someone had to bribe the police, the judges, the politicians. Someone had to enforce discipline, punish betrayals, eliminate competition. This was not the work of individuals. This was the work of organizations. And the organizations that emerged during Prohibition would reshape the landscape of American crime for generations. Chicago became the laboratory, the most visible, the most violent, the most infamous example of what Prohibition could create. Chicago had always been rough, a city built on slaughterhouses and steel mills and railroads, a place where labor disputes turned bloody and political machines ran with brazen corruption. But before Prohibition, organized crime in Chicago was relatively contained. Gambling, prostitution, labor, racketeering. The operations were run by men like James Colosimo, known as Big Jim, who controlled a network of brothels and gambling dens on the South Side. Colosimo had connections to the political machine, protection from the police, and a steady income from vice. He was comfortable, successful. And when his lieutenant, a man named Johnny Torrio, came to him in 1920 with an idea about bootlegging, Colosimo said no. He did not need the headache. He did not need the risk. He was making enough money from his existing operations. Bootlegging, Torrio argued, was the future. It was a gold rush. The profits would dwarf anything they were making from brothels. But Colosimo refused, so Torrio had him killed. The murder of Big Jim Colosimo on May 11th, 1920, marked the beginning of a new era. Torrio took control of Colosimo's operations, and he immediately pivoted to bootlegging. Torrio understood what Colosimo had not. Prohibition was not a problem. It was the greatest business opportunity of their lifetimes. The government had just outlawed the fifth largest industry in the country and created a black market with virtually unlimited demand. Whoever controlled that market would become richer than any gangster in history. Torrio set about building the infrastructure. He established supply lines from Canada, smuggling whiskey across the border and into Chicago. He opened breweries in the city, hidden operations that produced beer in defiance of the law. He cultivated relationships with speakeasy owners, offering them protection and supply in exchange for loyalty. He bribed police captains, ward bosses, judges. He negotiated with rival gangs, carving out territories and agreeing to mutual non-aggression, at least for a while. Torrio's protege was a young man named Alphonse Capone. Al Capone. Born in Brooklyn in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents, Capone had joined the Five Points gang as a teenager. He worked as a bouncer in brothels and bars, earning a reputation for violence and a scar on his face from a knife fight, which would later earn him the nickname Scarface, though no one called him that to his face. In his early 20s, Capone moved to Chicago at Torrio's invitation, becoming his bodyguard and right-hand man. Capone was smart, ruthless, and utterly without scruple when it came to advancing his interests. He was also charming, gregarious, a man who understood public relations in a way that most gangsters did not. He dressed well. He tipped generously. He cultivated an image as a businessman, a provider of a service that people wanted. Just a guy giving the public what it demanded. Torrio built the organization. Capone would expand it and defend it. The Chicago outfit, as it came to be known, was the dominant criminal enterprise on the South Side. But Chicago was not a unified city. The North Side was controlled by a different gang, led by a man named Dean O'Banion. O'Banion was an Irishman, a florist by day and a bootlegger by night, operating out of his flower shop on North State Street. He was a former choir boy with a volatile temper and a willingness to use violence when diplomacy failed. Torrio tried to maintain peace between the South Side Italians and the North Side Irish and Poles. He negotiated territories. He proposed cooperation. But cooperation was fragile, especially when the profits were so enormous and the temptation to expand was so strong. The Genna brothers, 6 Sicilian immigrants who ran bootlegging operations in Little Italy on the west side, were allied with Torrio. They encroached on O'Banion's territory. O'Banion complained to Torrio, expecting him to rein in the Gennas. Torrio did nothing. Whether he was unwilling or unable to control the Gennas is unclear. What is clear is that O'Banion felt betrayed, and in the world of Prohibition-era Chicago, betrayal was answered with bullets. But O'Banion was not the one who struck first. Torrio was. Or rather, Torrio arranged for others to strike. On November 10th, 1924, 3 men walked into O'Banion's flower shop. They shot him dead. 5 bullets. Execution style. The funeral was lavish, attended by thousands. The casket was bronze, lined with satin, covered in flowers. The North Side mourned, and then it prepared for war. Jaime Weiss, O'Banion's second-in-command, took over the North Side gang. Weiss had been a close friend of O'Banion, and he took the murder personally. Revenge became the North Side's priority. On January 24th, 1925, gunmen ambushed Torrio outside his apartment building. They shot him multiple times. Torrio survived, barely, but the experience was enough. He decided to retire. He handed control of the South Side operations to Capone and left Chicago. Capone was 26 years old. He was now in charge of the most lucrative bootlegging operation in the country. And he was at war with the North Side. The beer wars, as they came to be called, consumed Chicago for the next several years. Bombings, drive-by, shootings, ambushes, assassinations. The violence was relentless. The North Side tried to kill Capone multiple times. They failed. Capone's men retaliated. Weiss was killed in October 1926, gunned down outside his office by Capone's shooters. Vincent Trucci took over the North Side gang briefly until he was killed by a police officer in 1927. George Moran, known as Bugs Moran, became the next leader. The war continued. Hundreds of gangsters died. Not just the leaders, but the foot soldiers, the drivers, the enforcers, the men who guarded the breweries and rode shotgun on liquor shipments. The newspapers kept count. The public read the headlines with a mixture of horror and fascination. This was not the America that Prohibition was supposed to create. This was carnage. And yet, for all the violence, the business thrived. Capone's operation at its height in the late 1920s was bringing in an estimated $60 to $100 million per year. The range is wide because Capone did not file tax returns, and the exact accounting of an illegal enterprise is impossible to verify. But even the lower estimate, $60 million, was a staggering sum. Adjusted for inflation, it would be over $1 billion in today's money. This was not petty crime. This was an empire. The outfit controlled hundreds of speakeasies, dozens of breweries, gambling operations, prostitution rings. It employed thousands of people: drivers, guards, bartenders, accountants, lawyers, chemists. It was a vertically integrated business, controlling every step of the supply chain, from production to distribution to retail sale. And it operated with a level of sophistication that rivaled legitimate corporations. The bribery was systematic. Capone reportedly spent $500,000 per month paying off police, politicians, and federal investigators. $500,000 per month. In 1920s dollars, police captains received regular envelopes of cash. Judges were on the payroll. Ward bosses delivered votes and looked the other way. Even federal prohibition agents, the very men tasked with enforcing the Volstead Act, could be bought. Not all of them, certainly. There were honest cops and incorruptible agents. But there were enough corrupt ones to make enforcement a joke. A prohibition agent might raid a speakeasy, confiscate the liquor, arrest the bartender. The next day, the speakeasy would reopen with a new shipment. The bartender would be released after paying a fine. The confiscated liquor would mysteriously disappear from the evidence locker, often resold by the same officers who had seized it. The system was rotten from top to bottom. Capone himself became a celebrity, not in spite of his criminality, but because of it. He gave interviews to journalists. He posed for photographs. He attended the opera, the theater, the horse races. He was seen at restaurants, tipping waiters with $100 bills. He cultivated an image as a Robin Hood figure, a man of the people who provided jobs and services during hard times. When the stock market crashed in 1929 and the Great Depression began, Capone opened soup kitchens to feed the unemployed. The newspapers covered it. The public ate it up. Here was a gangster with a heart, a criminal who cared about the common man. The fact that his wealth came from bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution, the fact that his organization had killed hundreds of people, seemed almost beside the point. He was giving people what they wanted: alcohol, entertainment, a little bit of glamour in an otherwise grim world. But the glamour had a dark side. The violence was not confined to gangsters killing each other. Innocent people died in the crossfire. Bystanders caught in shootouts. Speakeasy patrons when a bomb went off. The wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the violence was not just in Chicago. Every major city had its own version of the beer wars. New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland. Bootlegging gangs fought for territory, for supply routes, for control of speakeasies. More than 1,000 people were killed in New York alone during Prohibition in mob-related violence. The numbers in other cities were proportionally similar. The carnage was national. And then came February 14th, 1929. Valentine's Day. A day that would become synonymous with the brutality of Prohibition-era Chicago. The details are well known, etched into American memory through countless retellings. 7 men associated with Bugs Moran's North Side Gang were in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. They were waiting for a shipment of hijacked whiskey. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, a car pulled up. Men in police uniforms got out. They entered the garage. The 7 men inside assumed it was a raid. Police raids were routine, an occupational hazard. You lined up, you let them search you, you paid a fine, you went home. The men lined up against the wall, and then the men in police uniforms opened fire, machine guns, Tommy guns. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The gunfire lasted only a few seconds, but when it stopped, 6 of the 7 men were dead. The 7th, a man named Frank Gusenberg, was still alive, though he had been shot 14 times. He would die a few hours later in the hospital, but not before police asked him who had done this. "Nobody shot me," he said, the code of silence held even in death. The men in police uniforms were not police. They were Capone's men, dressed as officers to gain entry without resistance. The massacre was planned, coordinated, executed with military precision. And it was intended to send a message. The North Side Gang was finished. Moran himself had not been in the garage that morning. He had been late, had seen the police car outside, and had walked away, assuming it was a raid he could avoid. His luck saved his life, but his gang was broken. The massacre marked the end of the beer wars. Capone had won. The public reaction was shock, horror, outrage. 7 men gunned down in cold blood, and in a manner so brazen, so theatrical, that it seemed like something from a gangster movie, not real life. The newspapers covered it for weeks. Editorials demanded action. The federal government, which had largely treated bootlegging as a local law enforcement problem, began to take notice. President Herbert Hoover, who had been inaugurated less than a month before the massacre, called a secret meeting at the White House. Representatives from the Chicago Crime Commission made their case. Chicago, they argued, was in the hands of gangsters. The police and the courts were completely controlled by organized crime. The city could not govern itself. Only the federal government had the resources and the authority to restore order. Hoover listened, and then he gave an order. All federal agencies were to concentrate their efforts on Al Capone. The Treasury Department, the Justice Department, the Prohibition Bureau. Everyone. Capone had become too visible, too powerful, too much of an embarrassment. He had to be brought down. But the Valentine's Day Massacre, for all its brutality, was not an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a system that had made violence profitable and cooperation impossible. Prohibition had created a zero-sum game. There was only so much territory, so many speakeasies, so much market share. If you wanted more, you had to take it from someone else. And the only way to take it was through force. Negotiation worked only as long as both sides believed they were better off cooperating than fighting. Once one side saw an advantage in violence, the truce collapsed, and violence begat more violence in an escalating cycle that consumed gangsters and bystanders alike. Yet even as the beer wars raged, even as bodies piled up in Chicago and York and Detroit. Something else was happening. The gangsters were learning. They were realizing that perpetual war was expensive. It drew attention. It brought federal heat. It was bad for business. Dead customers don't buy liquor. Dead gangsters don't pay tribute. And so, slowly, haltingly, the criminals began to cooperate. Not out of friendship or shared ideology, but out of mutual interest. The syndicates began to form. In New York, the process was more advanced than in Chicago. The city had always had multiple gangs operating simultaneously. Irish, Italian, Jewish. They controlled different neighborhoods, different rackets. Prostitution in one area, gambling in another, bootlegging in a third. Competition was fierce, but it was also inefficient. Turf wars cost money. Lost shipments cost money. Bribing duplicate sets of police officers cost money. A man named Charles Luciano, known as Lucky Luciano, saw the opportunity. Luciano was a visionary, in the same way that a corporate CEO is a visionary. He understood that cooperation was more profitable than competition. He began bringing together the Italian and Jewish mobsters in New York, convincing them that they could make more money working together than fighting each other. The ethnic lines began to blur. Italians working with Jews, Irish working with Poles. The cooperation was pragmatic, transactional, but it was real. In 1931, Luciano orchestrated the assassination of Salvatore Maranzano, a powerful Sicilian mobster who had declared himself boss of bosses after winning a gang war earlier that year. Maranzano's mistake was trying to consolidate power in the old way, through dominance and intimidation. Luciano wanted something different. He wanted a commission, a board of directors for organized crime. Representatives from the major crime families in New York would sit together, discuss issues, settle disputes, and agree on courses of action. No single boss would have absolute power. Decisions would be made collectively. It was a corporate structure applied to crime, and it worked. The commission, as it came to be called, operated for decades. It managed territories, resolved conflicts, authorized hits. It brought a level of stability to the underworld that had been impossible during the chaotic days of the beer wars. The commission model spread, not formally, but in practice. Crime syndicates in other cities began coordinating, sharing intelligence, avoiding unnecessary conflicts. The gangs that had started as street thugs and neighborhood enforcers were transforming into something that resembled multinational corporations. They had hierarchies, territories, profit-sharing agreements. They laundered money through legitimate businesses. They invested in real estate, restaurants, nightclubs. They hired lawyers and accountants. The line between organized crime and legitimate enterprise began to blur. Chicago followed a similar path, though it took longer. After Capone was imprisoned on tax evasion charges in 1931, the outfit continued under new leadership. Frank Nitti took over. The violence decreased, not because the criminals had become less ruthless, but because they had become smarter. Open warfare was bad for business. Better to operate quietly, to keep a low profile, to avoid the kind of headlines that brought federal investigators knocking. The outfit moved into other rackets, labor racketeering, extortion. The jukebox business of all things became a significant source of income. Gambling continued, prostitution continued. And when Prohibition ended in 1933, the bootleggers simply moved into the legitimate liquor business or expanded their operations into narcotics. The infrastructure was already in place. The distribution networks, the bribed officials, the enforcers. Prohibition ended, but organized crime did not. This was Prohibition's most enduring legacy, not the violence, though the violence was real and horrific, not the poisonings, though thousands died from tainted alcohol, but the creation of modern organized crime in America. Before Prohibition, criminal gangs were localized, fragmented, relatively easy for law enforcement to control. After Prohibition, they were national syndicates with reach into every major city, with operations that generated billions of dollars, with the political connections and financial resources to corrupt entire police departments and judicial systems. The structures built during Prohibition persisted long after the 18th Amendment was repealed. The Commission in New York operated into the 1950s and beyond. The Chicago outfit remained a powerful force for decades. Crime families in other cities followed similar patterns. The bootleggers became the narcotics traffickers. The guide speakeasy owners became the casino operators. The enforcers became the loan sharks and extortionists. Prohibition had given them the capital, the experience, and the organizational models to build criminal empires. And those empires outlasted the law that had created them. But the most visible aspect of Prohibition, the part that captured the public imagination and has endured in cultural memory, was not the boardrooms where gangsters divided up territories, or the backrooms where politicians accepted bribes. It was the speakeasies, the hidden bars, the secret clubs, the places where people went to drink and dance and forget, for a few hours, that they were breaking the law. Speakeasies proliferated during Prohibition. Estimates vary wildly, but by the mid-1920s, New York City alone had somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 illegal drinking establishments, depending on how one counted. The number is staggering. Before Prohibition, New York had about 15,000 licensed saloons. Prohibition did not reduce the number of places to drink. It increased them, and it changed their character entirely. The saloons had been male-dominated, working-class institutions, rough places. The speakeasies were different. They were secret, which gave them an air of adventure, of rebellion. They attracted a wider clientele, men and women, different classes mixing together, the wealthy slumming it with the working poor, the cultural ferment of the 1920s, the Jazz Age, the Harlem Renaissance, the loosening of social mores, all of it was concentrated in the speakeasies. Gaining entry to a speakeasy required knowing where it was and knowing the right people. Some had passwords, elaborate systems where you whispered a phrase to the doorman, who would then let you in or turn you away. Others relied on vouching. You brought a friend who was already known, or you slipped the bouncer a few dollars. Once inside, the atmosphere varied. Some speakeasies were elegant, stylish, indistinguishable from the best clubs of the pre-Prohibition era. Plush furniture, crystal glassware, live jazz bands. Others were dives, cramped rooms, sticky floors, cheap liquor served in chipped glasses. The quality of the alcohol varied just as widely. The best speakeasies served smuggled Canadian whiskey or pre-Prohibition stock that someone had hidden away. The worst served rot gut, bathtub gin, redistilled industrial alcohol that might or might not kill you. The customer rarely knew which they were getting until they tasted it, or until they woke up blind. The culture of the speakeasy was distinct. Women had rarely entered saloons before Prohibition. Social norms discouraged it. The saloon was a male space, but the speakeasy was different. Mixed company was the norm. Women drank, smoked, danced. The speakeasy was a space of liberation in its way. Not political liberation, though some of the patrons were certainly feminists and radicals, but personal liberation. The freedom to break a law that many considered unjust, the freedom to engage in behavior that society had tried to prohibit, and the knowledge that in doing so, you were part of a shared conspiracy, a collective act of defiance. The music in the speakeasies was jazz. Not always, but often enough that the two became linked in the popular imagination. Jazz was new, improvisational, African-American in origin, and deeply suspect to the guardians of traditional morality. It was loud, it was sexual. It encouraged dancing that the older generation found scandalous. Jazz and alcohol went together. Prohibition could not stop people from drinking, and it could not stop them from listening to jazz. In fact, Prohibition probably helped jazz spread because the speakeasies provided venues for musicians who might not have been welcome in more respectable establishments. The Harlem Renaissance, the explosion of African-American art and culture in New York in the 1920s, was nurtured in Soasinov, part by the clubs and speakeasies of Harlem, where black musicians played for integrated audiences in defiance of both the liquor laws and the social conventions of segregation. But the romantic image of the speakeasy, the glamorous rebels, sipping cocktails and listening to jazz, obscures a grimmer reality. The speakeasies were illegal, which meant they operated outside the law in every sense. There were no health inspections, no regulations on what could be served. The owners were criminals, or at least they were violating the law, and many of them had connections to organized crime. The outfit in Chicago controlled hundreds of speakeasies. The gangs in New York controlled thousands. The speakeasy owner paid tribute to the local syndicate in exchange for protection and supply. If you did not pay, your establishment was shut down, violently if necessary. The speakeasies were nodes in a criminal network, and the money flowing through them funded everything else. The bribery, the violence, the gang wars. The bartenders and servers in speakeasies were often complicit in practices that endangered their customers, watering down the liquor to make it go further, mixing cheap industrial alcohol with flavorings to pass it off as whiskey or gin, serving drinks they knew might be poisonous because the alternative was losing their job or worse. The customer had no recourse. If you got sick from the alcohol, you could not go to the police. You were breaking the law by drinking it. If you were cheated, overcharged, served poison, you had no legal remedy. The speakeasy existed in a space beyond regulation, beyond accountability, and that made it dangerous. Police raids were a constant threat, though in practice they were often theater. The police would get a tip, or they would decide to make a show of enforcement, and they would raid a speakeasy, break down the door, arrest the bartender and the patrons, confiscate the liquor. The newspapers would run a photo of officers pouring barrels of beer into the gutter or smashing bottles of whiskey. The public would see that the law was being enforced, and then, a few days later, the speakeasy would reopen. The bartender would be back. The liquor would flow again. Because the raid was not really about stopping the speakeasy. It was about maintaining appearances. The police had to be seen doing something, even if that something was ultimately futile. And the speakeasy owners knew this. They paid their fines. They repaired the damage. They reopened. It was a cost of doing business. The speakeasy culture, for all its flaws, was a visible manifestation of a deeper truth. Prohibition was failing. Not just failing to stop drinking, but failing to maintain the legitimacy of the law itself. When millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens are regularly breaking a law, when police officers are routinely ignoring violations or accepting bribes to look the other way, when judges are dismissing cases because the jails are full and the courts are overwhelmed, the law loses its moral authority. It becomes a joke. And that is what prohibition had become by the late 1920s. A joke. A failed experiment that everyone could see was failing, but that no one in power was willing to admit had failed. The gangsters knew it. The speakeasy owners knew it. The bartenders and the customers knew it. Even the police knew it. Prohibition was unenforceable. The demand for alcohol was too strong. The profits from supplying that demand were too large. The corruption was too deep. The violence was too widespread. And the human cost, both from the poisonings and from the gang wars, was too high. Something had to give. The question was when and how, and whether the political system could muster the will to undo what it had so confidently enacted just a decade before. Alphonse Capone, the most famous gangster in American history, the man who had built an empire on bootlegging and violence, the man who had ordered the Valentine's Day massacre and walked away untouched, would not live to see prohibition repealed. In 1931, he was convicted of tax evasion. Not murder, not bootlegging, not conspiracy or racketeering or any of the crimes that had made him rich and feared. Tax evasion. It was an ignoble end for a man who had cultivated such a public image. But it was effective. Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He served his time first in Atlanta, then at the newly opened prison on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. By the time he was released in 1939, his health was broken. Syphilis had ravaged his brain. He spent his final years in his mansion in Florida, a shadow of his former self, barely able to recognize his own family. He died in 1947, but the Chicago outfit did not die with him. It continued, under new leadership, with a lower profile, but with the same fundamental structure and many of the same rackets. Prohibition had built the machine. The repeal of prohibition did not dismantle it. The machine simply adapted, found new products to sell, new markets to exploit, new ways to extract profit from the margins of the law. Capone was gone. The syndicate endured. That was the legacy of prohibition, not the individual criminals, but the institutions they created. The networks of corruption, the acceptance of violence as a tool of business, the normalization of mass lawbreaking, the erosion of respect for legal authority. These things persisted long after the 18th Amendment was consigned to history. And in the midst of all this, in the speakeasies and the breweries and the warehouses and the streets, ordinary people were trying to navigate a world where having a drink could get you arrested or poisoned or caught in the crossfire of a gang war. They were not criminals in any meaningful sense. They were people who wanted to relax, to socialize, to enjoy themselves. But the law had made them criminals, and the enforcement of that law had made their choices potentially fatal. Prohibition promised a better America. It delivered organized crime, mass poisoning, and a level of violence and corruption that the country had never seen before. And by the late 1920s, as the bodies piled up and the gangsters grew richer and the speakeasies multiplied, it was becoming clear to more and more Americans that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. By the late 1920s, the arithmetic of prohibition no longer made sense to most Americans. The equation had seemed simple enough in 1920. Eliminate alcohol, and you eliminate the social ills that came with it. crime would decline, families would be stronger, workers would be more productive. Tax revenue lost from the liquor industry would be offset by the savings from reduced law enforcement, reduced hospitalizations, reduced poverty. It was a calculation that assumed compliance, that assumed the law would be respected and enforced, that assumed people would choose sobriety when alcohol became illegal. None of those assumptions held. Instead, the opposite occurred. Crime had exploded, not declined. Organized crime syndicates now controlled entire cities, their power built on bootlegging profits. The violence was impossible to ignore. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 was only the most spectacular example. Bombings, shootouts, assassinations had become routine in Chicago, New York, Detroit, Cleveland. More than 1,000 people killed in mob violence in New York alone. Similar numbers in other cities. These were not abstractions. These were bodies, funerals, families destroyed. And the public knew, everyone knew, that the violence stemmed directly from prohibition. Make alcohol illegal and you create a black market. Create a black market worth billions, and criminals will kill to control it. The poisoning deaths mounted alongside the gang murders. 10,000 dead from government-mandated toxins in industrial alcohol. Thousands more blinded, permanently disabled, brain damaged. Christmas 1926 in New York had been the turning point in public awareness, but the deaths continued year after year. The government knew the poison was killing people and continued adding it anyway. Charles Norris, New York's chief medical examiner, had said it plainly. The government bore moral responsibility. The words hung in the air, impossible to refute. You cannot claim you are protecting people while simultaneously poisoning them. Enforcement had failed spectacularly. The Prohibition Bureau was understaffed, underfunded, and thoroughly corrupted. Agents were paid poorly and bribed easily. Estimates suggested that $500,000 per month changed hands in Chicago alone, buying protection for bootleggers. Police departments in major cities were on the take. Judges dismissed cases. Juries refused to convict. The jails were full of small-time offenders, while the major bootleggers operated openly. Al Capone attended the opera. He gave interviews. The government couldn't touch him for bootlegging or murder, only for failing to pay taxes on his illegal income. The law had become a farce, and respect for law itself had eroded. When millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens break a law regularly, when police selectively enforce it, when prosecutors decline to pursue cases, the law loses legitimacy. Prohibition had made criminals of ordinary people who wanted a drink with dinner. It had normalized lawbreaking. An entire generation was learning that laws were suggestions, that rules could be ignored if they seemed unreasonable, that authority was corrupt and hypocritical. This was not the moral regeneration the prohibitionists had promised. This was moral corrosion. Women, ironically, led the charge for repeal. The same demographic that had been instrumental in passing prohibition began demanding its end. Pauline Sabin, a wealthy Republican who had initially supported the 18th Amendment, became disillusioned. She watched prohibition fail to achieve its goals. She watched it create violence, corruption, and an underground drinking culture that was worse than the saloons had been. In 1929, she founded the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. The WON-PR challenged the assumption that the Women's Christian Temperance Union spoke for all American women. It attracted former prohibitionists, society women, working-class mothers. By 1933, its membership reached 1.5 million. The women argued that prohibition had not protected families, it had endangered them. The violence, the poisonings, the corruption, all of it threatened the social fabric more than alcohol ever had. Then came October 1929. The stock market crashed. The prosperity of the Roaring Twenties evaporated overnight. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment soared. Bread lines formed in cities across the country. The Great Depression had arrived, and it reframed the debate over prohibition entirely. What had been a moral argument became an economic one. The numbers were stark. Prohibition enforcement cost approximately $40 million annually. The federal government was spending money to enforce a law that generated no revenue. Meanwhile, estimates suggested that legalizing alcohol could raise $861 million in tax revenue, nearly $1 billion. During prosperity, these figures were abstract. During the Depression, they were urgent. The government was broke, people were starving, and the government was spending scarce resources to prevent people from drinking, while organized crime reaped billions in untaxed profits. The economic argument cut through the moral posturing. Jobs. The brewing and distilling industries had employed tens of thousands before Prohibition. Those jobs could return. Tax revenue. The federal treasury was depleted. Alcohol taxes could help fund relief programs. The Depression made prohibition seem not just ineffective, but actively harmful, a waste of resources during a national emergency. The political coalition that had supported prohibition began to fracture. Rural areas remained dry. Protestant churches maintained their opposition, but urban areas, where the violence and corruption were most visible, turned wet. The 1930 midterm elections brought Democratic majorities to Congress. The Democrats had made repeal part of their platform. They argued that ending prohibition would create jobs, raise revenue, and restore respect for law. The tide had shifted. The 1932 presidential election became a referendum on prohibition. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic candidate, supported repeal. He was cautious about it, having wavered on the issue for years. But his party's platform was clear. The 18th Amendment must go. Herbert Hoover, the Republican incumbent who had called prohibition a noble experiment, defended it half-heartedly. The public was not listening. Roosevelt won in a landslide, 22.8 million votes to 15.7 million. The mandate was unmistakable. Congress moved quickly. On February 20th, 1933, just weeks after Roosevelt's inauguration, Congress proposed the 21st Amendment. It would repeal the 18th. But the method of ratification was unusual. Instead of sending the amendment to state legislatures, where temperance forces still held influence, Congress called for state conventions. Elected delegates would vote on repeal. It was closer to direct democracy, harder for the Anti-Saloon League to manipulate. Roosevelt did not wait for full repeal. On March 22, 1933, he signed the Cullen-Harrison Act, legalizing beer with 3.2% alcohol and light wine. It took effect April 7th, the first legal beer in 13 years. The country celebrated. Breweries reopened. The Budweiser Clydesdales delivered a ceremonial case to the White House. It was a preview of what full repeal would bring. The state conventions ratified the 21st Amendment with stunning speed. Michigan voted first in April. Other states followed through the spring and summer. The ratification required 36 states, 3/4 of the 48. By late autumn, the count was approaching the threshold. On December 5th, 1933, Utah became the 36th state to ratify. At 5:32 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Acting Secretary of State William Phillips certified that the amendment had been adopted. 17 minutes later, at 5:49 p.m., he made the official announcement. Prohibition was over. The ratification had taken 9 months, the fastest in American history, faster even than the 18th Amendment had been ratified. The noble experiment had lasted 13 years, 10 months, and 19 days. It ended not with violence or resistance, but with relief, exhaustion, a collective acknowledgement that the experiment had failed, that the costs had exceeded any possible benefits, that it was time to move on. President Roosevelt issued a proclamation. His tone was measured, almost parental. I trust in the good sense of the American people that they will not bring upon themselves the curse of excessive use of intoxicating liquors to the detriment of health, morals, and social integrity. The implicit message, you have your alcohol back. Do not make us regret this. Some states remained dry. Mississippi would not fully legalize alcohol until 1966. Kansas prohibited public bars until 1987. Local option laws allowed counties and municipalities to vote themselves dry, and many did. Prohibition lived on in pockets, but as a national policy, it was finished. Al Capone, the man who had profited more than anyone from Prohibition's failures, was already in prison. Convicted of tax evasion in 1931, he would never return to power. His conviction had been portrayed as a victory over organized crime, but it was nothing of the sort. The Chicago outfit continued under Frank Nitti. The operations that Capone had built persisted. They simply moved into other rackets. Gambling, labor racketeering, narcotics eventually. The infrastructure remained. The corruption remained. The violence became quieter, more controlled, but it did not disappear. Organized crime had been Prohibition's most enduring creation. The syndicates that emerged in the 1920s, the networks of cooperation and corruption, the criminal enterprises that operated like corporations, these outlasted the law that spawned them. The commission in New York, the outfit in Chicago, crime families in every major city, they had been empowered by Prohibition, enriched by it, given the capital and experience to build empires. When Prohibition ended, they did not dissolve. They adapted. The legacy was deeper than the persistence of organized crime. Prohibition had expanded federal power in unprecedented ways. Wiretapping, surveillance, mass enforcement campaigns. The machinery of the federal prohibition apparatus would be repurposed for future wars. The war on drugs would follow similar patterns decades later. The same logic: make something illegal, enforce through criminalization and punishment, accept collateral damage as the cost of righteousness. Prohibition was the template, and it had normalized the idea that the Constitution could be amended and then unamended, that what seemed permanent could be undone. The 21st Amendment was the only amendment ever to repeal a previous amendment. It established a precedent. Even constitutional changes can fail. Even sacred texts can be revised when reality demands. Prohibition ended on December 5th, 1933. The speakeasies became bars. The bootleggers became liquor distributors, or went to prison, or moved into other criminal enterprises. The poison stopped flowing into the industrial alcohol supply. The enforcement apparatus was dismantled. Life returned, in some sense, to normal. But the scars remained. 10,000 dead from government-sanctioned poisoning, thousands more from gang violence, an entire generation that had learned to disrespect the law, a criminal infrastructure that would plague American cities for the rest of the century, a precedent for federal overreach that would be cited and repeated. These were the costs, the butcher's bill for the noble experiment. Wayne Wheeler had died in 1927, before the collapse became inevitable. He never saw his life's work undone. Perhaps that was mercy. The Anti-Saloon League faded into irrelevance, renamed and repurposed multiple times, a shadow of its former power. The prohibitionists had been utterly defeated. Their arguments had been tested and found wanting. Their predictions had been proven wrong. Alcohol had not been eliminated. Crime had not decreased. Families had not been saved. America had not become more moral. It had become more cynical, more corrupt, more violent, and in the end, more thirsty. The great irony was that prohibition probably increased drinking among some populations, particularly women and young people. The speakeasy culture had made drinking fashionable, rebellious, exciting. The forbidden fruit was sweeter. When prohibition ended, alcohol consumption did not spike. It normalized. The crisis that the temperance movement had feared, the unleashing of uncontrolled drinking after 13 years of deprivation, never materialized. People drank. Some drank too much, but most did not. The moral panic that had justified prohibition in the first place had been overblown. 13 years. That is how long it took for America to realize that legislating morality through constitutional amendment was a catastrophic mistake. 13 years of violence, corruption, and death. And at the end of it, the country was right back where it started. Alcohol was legal. People were drinking. The saloons had returned, though now they were called bars. The only difference was the legacy of damage left behind. The dead, the traumatized, the criminals empowered, the institutions corrupted. The lesson, if there was one, was simple. You cannot prohibit what people want badly enough. You can only drive it underground and make it more dangerous. Prohibition proved that, definitively, at tremendous cost. Good evening began with a glass, a simple thing that became a symbol of government overreach, criminal enterprise, and the limits of legislating virtue. Prohibition was not a sudden madness. It was built from reasonable concerns, legitimate grievances, and the genuine belief that society could be perfected through law. The temperance movement saw real suffering, families destroyed by alcoholism, violence fueled by drink, poverty deepened by wages spent in saloons. They were not wrong about the problems. They were catastrophically wrong about the solution. The arithmetic is inescapable. 10,000 dead from poisoned alcohol. Thousands more from gang violence. Organized crime transformed from neighborhood rackets into national syndicates. Police departments corrupted. Courts overwhelmed. Respect for law itself eroded when millions of otherwise decent people became criminals for wanting a drink. The costs exceeded any conceivable benefit. Initial declines in alcohol consumption were real but temporary. Cirrhosis deaths fell, then rose again. The violence prohibition created dwarfed whatever violence alcohol itself had caused. The moral question haunts still. Did the government commit murder when it ordered industrial alcohol poisoned, knowing people would drink it and die? not in the legal sense, but Charles Norris was right about moral responsibility. The government knew the poison would kill, knew bootleggers would redistill it, knew speakeasies would serve it, knew ordinary people would drink it, and continued anyway. That calculus, the willingness to accept deaths as enforcement strategy, reveals something uncomfortable about righteous certainty. When you believe your cause is just enough, any cost becomes acceptable. Any body count becomes collateral damage. Prohibition revealed other truths. That demand cannot be legislated away. That making something illegal does not make it disappear, only makes it more dangerous. That prohibition creates black markets, and black markets create violence. That corruption follows wherever large profits meet legal restrictions. These lessons would be forgotten, relearned, forgotten again in subsequent decades, with different substances, different enforcement regimes, similar results. The syndicate's prohibition created outlasted it by generations. Al Capone died broken and forgotten, but the Chicago outfit persisted. The commission in New York operated for decades. The infrastructure of organized crime, the networks of corruption, the acceptance of violence as business tool, these became permanent features of American life. Prohibition built that, deliberately through policy choices that prioritized enforcement over consequences. When Prohibition ended December 5, 1933, it left behind graves, trauma, and distrust. The great irony, after 13 years of constitutional prohibition, federal enforcement, and tremendous suffering, Americans returned to drinking, not in a crisis of unleashed debauchery, but normally, moderately for most. The feared catastrophe of repeal never came. People simply wanted the freedom to choose. The poisoning program ended. The speakeasies became bars. The bootleggers faded or adapted. But the questions Prohibition raised about government power, individual liberty, and acceptable costs for policy goals never ended. They echo, still in debates over criminalization, enforcement, and the price of righteousness. Prohibition promised salvation, delivered poison, and taught a lesson that each generation must apparently learn anew. You cannot force virtue at gunpoint. You can only create suffering and call it justice. The glass that began this story was ordinary. The consequences were not.